Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Grab that stack of sources you sent our way because today we are plunging into, well, a truly transformative period in modern American history,
hmm
the 1970s and early 1980s.
That's right. We're talking about those tumultuous years. It spans from the later Nixon era through Watergate, the energy crises,
Right.
that frustrating economic puzzle called stagflation, the complex winding down of détente with the Soviet Union, and then, dawn of the Reagan years. It's a lot, a period packed with profound shifts.
It really is. And our mission, kind of guided by these notes and articles you've shared, is to dig beneath the surface, maybe pull out the most important threads, connect some surprising dots, and give you the key insights on how these years didn't just happen, but, well, fundamentally shape the world we're living in right now.
Think of it as getting the essential download on a relatively short but intensely impactful era often gets overshadowed, maybe.
Yeah, by what came before and after.
Exactly. So let's make sense of it together.
All right, let's get into it. We're setting the scene right at the beginning of this period with Richard Nixon in the White House. One of the most striking things the sources highlight immediately is a major pivot in U.S. foreign policy, particularly towards the Soviet Union and China.
Absolutely. And that pivot is centered around the concept of détente, the relaxation of tensions. It's fascinating because Nixon, a lifelong anti-communist, pursued this.
Kind of ironic, wasn't it?
Very. His national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, was doing crucial groundwork, including those, well, now famous secret trips to both China and the Soviet Union to prepare the way for summits.
And what was Nixon's strategic thinking behind this? The sources point out he saw an opportunity in the clash between the USSR and China over their interpretations of Marxism. He figured the U.S. could leverage that division.
Exactly. The idea was to play China off the Soviets, opening lines of communication with both to gain a strategic advantage. And a key goal, especially at this time, was to enlist their aid in pressuring North Vietnam to help the U.S. find an exit from that long, grinding war.
This approach wasn't driven by shared ideology, but something the sources call realpolitik foreign policy, based purely on national interests, right? Not on idealistic principles.
That's it. Nixon himself spoke about achieving a balance of power in the world, seeing détente as a key tool to manage the rivalry between major players like the U.S., Europe, the Soviets, China, and Japan.
And the most dramatic illustration of this realpolitik in action was that historic visit to China in February 1972. Nixon and Kissinger actually traveled there to meet with Mao Zedong.
Yeah, incredible. This reversed decades of U.S. policy since 1949 that hadn't even recognized the communist government.
That's huge. What came out of that visit, immediately?
The immediate outcomes included the U.S. supporting China's admission to the United Nations and agreeing to pursue economic and cultural exchanges. Official diplomatic recognition would come later, in '79 under Carter, but the door was definitely opened here. It was a geopolitical earthquake.
And this China card, as it became known, significantly impacted relations with the Soviet Union as well. The Soviets were still dealing with the fallout from their 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia,
Right.
where the U.S., kind of tied up in Vietnam, couldn't really intervene effectively.
Right. So when Nixon went to Moscow in May 1972, the Soviets had their own motivations. They were interested in access to U.S. foodstuffs, for one,
Okay.
and they were genuinely concerned about closer ties between the U.S. and China. Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, reportedly approached Nixon about nuclear arms imitation talks, which became a cornerstone of détente.
And Nixon flew to Russia specifically to sign that treaty. That Moscow visit really cemented the era of détente, aiming to create a set of rules, maybe, to govern the intense rivalry between the superpowers.
And it led to some tangible agreements. The most prominent was SALT-MEST, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, signed in May 1972.
Saltmore. Okay.
Both sides agreed to stop producing nuclear ballistic missiles and drastically reduce anti-ballistic missile systems.
But the sources also point out a critical development happening almost simultaneously that complicated things.
Yeah.
The U.S. development of MIRVs.
Exactly. Multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles. These allowed a single missile to carry multiple warheads. Big change.
So while SALT, I limited the number of missile launchers,
Right.
it didn't stop the increase in warhead.
Precisely. The sources note that by the 1990s, both the U.S. and Soviets had ballooned their warhead numbers to nearly 20,000 each. So yeah, it shows that while détente managed rivalry, it didn't truly end the arms race.
Oh, okay.
Another key agreement was the 1972 grain deal, a massive sale of U.S. agricultural products to the USSR.
So how should we think about détente based on these sources? Was it like a success Or,
The sources offer a balanced view, I'd say. They suggest it was quite successful in its immediate goals, essentially, checkmating and co-opting the communist powers to help facilitate an exit from Vietnam. However, it clearly didn't dismantle the underlying rivalry, as evidenced by the continuing arms buildup despite treaties like Sulphur's. It was more about managing competition than achieving genuine peace, you know?
right, managing it. Makes
Yeah.
sense. While all this high-stakes foreign policy was playing out, something else was brewing that would hit Americans directly in their wallets and gas tanks.
Yeah.
The energy crisis of 1973.
Oh, yeah. This was directly triggered by the Yom Kippur War in October 1973. Arab nations felt significant bitterness toward Western countries, particularly the U.S., for their support of Israel.
And that led to the Arab oil embargo. This wasn't just about economics, it was a political weapon, wasn't it?
Totally. Its explicit purpose was to pressure Western nations to force Israel to withdraw from lands held since the 1967 Six-Day War.
Okay.
Kissinger was involved again, negotiating an Israeli withdrawal west of the Suez Canal, which prompted the Arabs to lift the boycott. But OPEC,
The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries.
right, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran,
Yeah.
they saw an opportunity and seized control of pricing.
And their action was dramatic. They massively hiked oil prices, jumping from about $3 a barrel to over $11.
Yeah, a huge jump. And this wasn't just about the boycott. Their demands also included U.S. recognition of the PLO and support for other Arab positions.
The impact on the U.S. must have been immediate.
Oh, immediate and painful. Gas prices doubled, and inflation, which was already a concern, absolutely soared, pushing past 10%.
Wow.
The sources point out that Nixon's decision not to ration gasoline, coupled with the sudden price shock, led to widespread shortages and those infamous long lines at gas stations across the country. It brought the geopolitical situation right into people's daily lives.
Wow, that energy crisis really underscores how global events were directly impacting the domestic scene. Let's shift gears and unpack Nixon's domestic landscape during this time. Beyond the foreign policy and the beginnings of economic turmoil, what was happening on the home front?
Domestically, Nixon introduced concepts he called New Federalism. A key piece of this was the Revenue Sharing Act of 1972.
Revenue sharing. Okay.
Yeah, it funneled about $30 billion in federal money directly to states over 5 years. It was an attempt to kind of reverse the flow of power towards Washington seen in previous decades.
Interesting.
Nixon also considered more radical ideas like shifting welfare to states and proposing a minimum income, although those didn't really gain traction in Congress.
The sources paint a complex picture on civil rights during his administration. On one hand, he attempted to block extensions of the Voting Rights Act and tried to delay desegregation orders in places like Mississippi.
Right.
He even proposed an anti-busing bill after the Supreme Court ordered busing for desegregation in 1971, though Congress blocked that.
Yet the sources also note that Nixon did take actions that furthered affirmative action, specifically by setting hiring goals and timetables for companies to employ women and minorities.
So it wasn't a simple story of opposition. There were seemingly contradictory moves.
Exactly. It's complicated.
And speaking of the Supreme Court, Nixon appointed Warren E. Burger, who was seen as a conservative, as Chief Justice. But the Burger Court produced some surprisingly liberal decisions, according to the sources.
That's right. The court declared the death penalty, as it was then applied, unconstitutional in 1972, and, of course, famously, the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision struck down state laws prohibiting abortion.
Yeah, not necessarily the conservative outcomes many expected from Nixon's appointments.
Not at all.
Congress was also active, passing significant legislation, sometimes in areas where Nixon might have been reluctant. For instance, the 26th Amendment in 1971, lowering the voting age to 18. Driven by that argument, if you're old enough to be drafted and die for your country, you're old enough to vote.
Makes sense. They also increased Social Security benefits and food stamp funding in 1970 and created the Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA, in 1970 to oversee worker safety.
OSHA, right.
The Federal Election Campaign Act was another piece, aiming to limit campaign contributions.
One area that really surged in prominence during this era was environmentalism. The sources point to Earth Day on April 25th, 1970, as a kind of symbolic start for the modern environmental movement in the U.S.
And perhaps counterintuitively, given conservative concerns about regulation noted in the sources, Nixon established the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, in 1970.
The EPA under Nixon. Still surprising.
Yeah. While some sources suggest it was maybe initially created to manage or even stall the movement, it quickly became central to environmental protection efforts. Its creation built on decades of prior work, notably spurred by Rachel Carson's seminal book Silent Spring back in '62.
Silent Spring, yeah. That really woke people up to the effects of pesticides.
Absolutely. And we did see progress in subsequent years, things like cleaner air from reduced auto emissions and efforts to clean up polluted waterways. But the sources note there's real tension here, with both Nixon and later Ford often opposing environmental legislation due to concerns about the costs and burden on businesses.
That tension became very visible with issues like toxic waste. The story of Love Canal, New York became a national symbol of the problem, didn't it?
Oh, definitely. A residential area built on an old chemical waste dump became so polluted, the EPA declared it unfit for habitation. Residents were evacuated, homes abandoned, the whole area sealed off. Just terrible.
This led to the creation of the Superfund law in 1980 under President Carter, specifically for cleaning up these dangerous toxic dumps.
Right. And the sources note that this law, among others, contributed to a significant reduction in reported toxic chemical releases by the end of the century. So progress, but after a disaster.
Public concern also grew around nuclear power, heightened dramatically by the 3 Mile Island accident in March 1979 near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
TMI.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the worst U.S. nuclear power incident at the time. While fears of a massive radiation release didn't materialize, there was a core meltdown, and 100,000 residents were evacuated. The reactor was shut down for years.
Must have terrified people.
It did. Environmental groups intensified their protests, but the sources indicate that the nuclear power lobby remained very influential and prevented significant legislative changes. Despite this, other environmental protections were enacted, like the Endangered Species Act of 1973.
Which led to a huge increase in protected land and water areas, reportedly by 300%, and helped species like the bald eagle recover.
Exactly. Bald eagle, peregrine falcon, gray whale. Real success stories. But like many environmental laws, it faced criticism, particularly regarding wetland regulations and the Endangered Species Act itself. Opponents argued they imposed unconstitutional restrictions on landowners and took valuable land out of production.
So you have this mix of ambitious policy, shifting social landscapes, and growing environmental awareness, all happening against a backdrop of increasing economic trouble. The sources describe initial attempts under Nixon in 1969 to cool the economy with spending cuts and tax hikes, plus Fed interest rate increases.
Yeah.
But the economy seemed to just get worse.
Yes, unemployment started climbing, the GNP declined, and the U.S. even saw a trade deficit by 1971. But the really crippling issue was inflation. It hit 12% by 1971.
12%. The sources call this the longest and steepest inflationary cycle in U.S. history up to that point, noting the cost of living essentially tripled between 1969 and 1981.
Oof. Attempts were made to control it. Congress gave the president power to regulate prices and wages, leading to Nixon's 90-day price and wage freeze in 1971.
Wage freeze, right.
He also took the U.S. off the gold standard that year. There were mandatory guidelines, then voluntary ones later, but inflation persisted. The sources even mentioned Nixon's controversial practice of impounding funds, basically refusing to spend money Congress had appropriated in an effort to cut government spending and fight inflation.
Impounding funds, wow. So what were the underlying causes of this economic stagnation and inflation? According to the sources, it wasn't just one thing, was it?
No, definitely not. Several factors converged. Federal deficits from the 1960s, due to the costs of both the Great Society social programs and the Vietnam War, played a role. The U.S. was also facing increasing international competition, particularly from rebuilt economies like Germany and Japan, losing some of the economic dominance it held after WWII.
The sources also point to the U.S. being perhaps a bit complacent, slow to modernize its industrial plants and seek efficiencies compared to competitors.
That's mentioned, yeah. And as we discussed, the rising energy costs due to the situation in the Middle East were a major inflationary driver.
Right, the oil shocks.
Other factors mentioned include an increase in women and teenagers entering the workforce, often taking part-time jobs, which some viewed as impacting long-term skill development. There was also a structural shift from manufacturing to a service economy, where productivity gains were perceived as being harder to achieve.
And that inflationary impact of military and welfare spending from the 60s, without corresponding tax increases to soak up that extra money, was also cited.
All these elements combined to create that new, frustrating economic phenomenon that really defined the mid-1970s under Ford and Carter: stagflation.
Stagflation, that terrible combination of slowing economic growth and rising inflation. The sources show industry slowing down, inflation hitting 11% in 1974, and unemployment soaring above 9% in 1975. It was a truly difficult economic environment.
And while the economy was struggling, another crisis was building that would eclipse almost everything else politically: Watergate. The sources are clear this was the biggest presidential scandal in U.S. history, and it led directly to Nixon's resignation.
It really peeled back the layers on Nixon's administration. The sources describe his secretive nature and how he increasingly isolated himself, surrounding himself with fiercely loyal aides like H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, which paradoxically protected him from criticism, but perhaps also insulated him from reality.
And they weren't just isolated. They were actively compiling an enemies list, over 200 individuals and 18 organizations, including prominent politicians, civil rights leaders, academics, actors, journalists.
An enemies list.
Yeah. The administration used federal agencies like the FBI to spy and discredit opponents, and even ordered the IRS to harass them with tax audits. Just wow.
There was even an illegal plan involving the FBI, CIA, and military intelligence targeting the anti-war movement, which FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover apparently blocked because he feared it would backfire on Nixon the way the anti-war movement had impacted Lyndon Johnson.
Right, Hoover himself blocked it. This environment of paranoia and political warfare led to the creation of CREEP, the committee to re-elect the president.
Okay.
The sources suggest Nixon was genuinely worried about the 1972 election after Republican losses in 1970 and his own past narrow defeats. CREEP engaged in massive illegal fundraising and maintained a dirty tricks fund aimed at sabotaging Democratic opponents.
This is where the White House plumbers come in. They were created specifically to stop anti-Nixon leaks to the press, right?
Exactly. And the trigger for the plumbers' actions, according to the sources, was the publication of the Pentagon Papers by the New York Times.
The Pentagon Papers, yeah.
These leaked documents reveal that the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, used to escalate the Vietnam War, was based on questionable intelligence, maybe even a lie, discrediting the Johnson administration. Nixon feared similar leaks damaging his own presidency.
So the plumbers targeted Daniel Ellsberg, the analyst who leaked the papers, and took the extreme step of breaking into a psychiatrist's office looking for anything embarrassing.
Right, though they found nothing useful.
Which brings us to the infamous event that started it all. The Watergate break-in in the summer of 1972. Burglars, hired by CREEP, were caught trying to bug the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C.
Initially, Nixon and his aides publicly denied any involvement and immediately began a systematic cover-up. And at first, the public seemed to believe them.
But the story didn't die. Two young reporters at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein.
Woodward and Bernstein, legendary now.
Yeah, they were relentless in their investigation.
And their reporting was explosive. They linked two of the burglars and a White House aide directly to CREEP and uncovered a pattern of other illegal activities orchestrated by Nixon's advisors. Critically, they discovered silence money.
Silence money.
Yeah, that Nixon had authorized payments of over $460,000 from CREEP funds to the burglars to buy their silence about the White House connection. Wow. By 1973, the pressure was mounting. The Watergate trial and subsequent Senate hearings exposed the full scope of the cover-up and the pressure put on the defendants. Nixon announced the resignations of his three closest aides implicated in the scandal.
Then came the demand that changed everything: the Watergate tapes. The Senate committee and the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, requested recordings Nixon had secretly made of conversations in the Oval Office.
And Nixon refused, claiming executive privilege and national security concerns.
Leading to the dramatic Saturday Night Massacre.
Oh, yeah. Nixon ordered his attorney general to fire special prosecutor Cox, but the attorney general refused and resigned. Nixon then ordered the deputy attorney general to fire Cox. He also refused and resigned. Finally, the third highest-ranking official in the Justice Department complied. The public reaction to this blatant obstruction was massive outrage.
Unbelievable. And adding to the administration's troubles, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned in October 1973 after pleading no contest to charges of tax evasion and accepting bribes while governor of Maryland.
Right, so Nixon nominated Gerald R. Ford to replace him under the provisions of the 25th Amendment.
Nixon also faced personal financial scrutiny, being forced to pay back over $500,000 in back taxes and facing accusations of using public funds for improvements to his private homes.
The fight over the tapes continued. Nixon eventually released edited transcripts, but key sections were clearly missing, including that infamous 18-minute gap.
The 18-minute gap, right?
When he still refused to hand over the unedited tapes, the special prosecutor took the case to the Supreme Court.
And in U.S. v. Nixon, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously against the president, forcing him to release the tapes.
That was pretty much the end game. The tapes, released on August 5, 1974, contained these smoking gun conversations, proving Nixon was involved in the cover-up almost from the beginning. Impeachment by the House seemed certain.
So on August 7, 1974, Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency. Gerald Ford was sworn in the next day, the first and only U.S. president to serve without being elected to either the presidency or vice presidency.
And the aftermath of Watergate continued under Ford. Just a month after taking office, in September 1974, Ford issued a full pardon to Nixon for any crimes he might have committed while president.
Which was incredibly controversial.
Hugely. The sources note that many Americans were outraged, questioning if a secret deal had been struck, especially since Nixon hadn't been charged or admitted wrongdoing. It significantly heightened the public's skepticism of government, already strained by the Vietnam War.
While Nixon was pardoned, 31 members of his administration were convicted and went to prison for their roles in Watergate-related crimes.
Yeah, people did go to jail. And the sources suggest the pardon likely cost Ford the 1976 election.
The events of Watergate, coming after the expansions of executive power during the Cold War in Vietnam, really solidified a concern about what critics called the imperial presidency.
Right. This idea was that presidents had gradually accumulated powers historically belonging to Congress, a trend visible since WWII.
The sources cite examples like FDR's court-packing attempt or making treaties without Senate consent.
The Story Bases deal, Atlantic Charter, Yalta.
Truman fighting Korea without a declaration of war, Johnson doing the same in Vietnam, and Nixon's actions like impounding funds, the Cambodia invasion without approval, and the use of federal agencies against opponents seen in Watergate.
It's a pattern. In response to Vietnam and Watergate, Congress actively sought to reclaim some of its power. The War Powers Act of 1973 was a major step.
Requiring the president to consult Congress before committing troops for more than 90 days.
Right. The Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974 directly addressed Nixon's impounding of funds, prohibiting the president from doing that.
Okay.
The Federal Election Campaign Act of 1972, later amended, aimed to limit campaign contributions, reacting to things like creeps' illegal funding.
And the Privacy Act, which expanded the Freedom of Information Act, was a direct response to the misuse of agencies like the FBI. It gave citizens more access to government files and put the burden of proof on the government to justify classifying information.
Right. The sources even mentioned the Iran-Contra scandal under Reagan in 1987 as a later example that some saw as a continuation of this imperial presidency trend, specifically the secret diversion of funds to the Nicaraguan Contras against a congressional prohibition.
So Gerald Ford takes over in this environment of political fallout and economic difficulty. His short presidency is immediately defined by that controversial Nixon pardon in September 1974.
Yeah, hangs over him from day one. And economically, he was stuck with that persistent stagflation. His efforts included trying to rally public support for voluntary restraints on inflation, even promoting win buttons, whip inflation now.
Win buttons. Did they work?
Not really. Inflation did dip briefly, but came right back. Ford's economic proposals generally favored stimulating business, asking for tax cuts, and arguing against increased spending on social programs. He was known for frequently using his veto power, rejecting over 50 bills in his less than 3 years in office.
In foreign policy, there were notable events. The Helsinki Conference in July 1975 involved 34 countries.
Right, Helsinki. It effectively finalized the post-WWII borders in Eastern Europe, legitimizing the Soviet sphere of influence. In return, the Soviets agreed to more human rights protections and exchanges.
But did they follow through?
Well, the sources note they largely reneged on those promises. Despite Ford continuing détente, U.S.-Soviet relations deteriorated somewhat, partly because the U.S. was concerned about continued Soviet support and arms shipments to pro-communist groups globally.
And a major blow during his term was the final fall of South Vietnam in April 1975, with Saigon captured by North Vietnamese forces.
Yeah, Ford couldn't get Congress to approve more aid. To many Americans, it felt like the entire U.S. involvement and sacrifice had just been in vain, a really low point.
Ford also faced a brief military confrontation with Cambodia in May 1975, just 2 weeks after the communist takeover there. They seized the American merchant ship Mayagas.
Right. Ford ordered a marine assault on Tang Island to recover the ship and crew. While the ship and crew were released, the operation was costly, with 38 Marines killed. A stark reminder of the volatile post-Vietnam environment.
All of these challenges set the stage for the election of 1976. Gerald Ford narrowly won the Republican nomination, fending off a strong challenge from Ronald Reagan.
Reagan again waiting in the wings.
Yeah, Ford was weighed down by the Nixon pardon and his perceived acceptance of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe after Helsinki.
The Democrats nominated Jimmy Carter, the former governor of Georgia and a peanut farmer, a real outsider.
He capitalized on the post-Watergate cynicism by running as a complete Washington outsider, emphasizing personal integrity with his campaign pledge, "I'll never lie to you." His born-again Baptist faith was also a prominent part of his public image.
The sources characterize Carter as a conservative Democrat, someone who questioned the expansion of government seen in the 60s and was open to a larger role for religion in public life.
And he narrowly defeated Ford. Carter won 297 electoral votes to 240, taking 51% of the popular vote. He surprisingly swept every state in the South except Virginia and received massive support from black voters, reportedly 97%.
Yeah, huge support there. Democrats also maintained large majorities in Congress, creating an environment where Carter potentially could have been quite effective. But Jimmy Carter's presidency became a story of idealism meeting very harsh realities.
Domestically, he did have some notable achievements. He followed through on a campaign promise to pardon 10,000 Vietnam-era draft evaders. He created new cabinet-level departments, including the Department of Education and the Department of Energy.
Right, energy in response to the crisis.
He reformed the civil service system, moving it towards a merit basis, and as we mentioned, he established the Superfund for cleaning up toxic waste sites.
He also established controls on strip mining and significantly protected Alaskan wilderness areas. And yes, the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident occurred in 1979 during his term, adding to the national conversation about energy safety.
Energy issues continued to define his presidency. Beyond creating the Department of Energy, he proposed taxes on gasoline and inefficient cars.
Though Congress largely gutted that plan. And a second major fuel shortage hit in 1979, triggered by the Iranian Revolution, causing more pain at the pump. Another round of gas lines.
Economically, stagflation was his persistent nemesis. While he passed a tax cut in 1978 and proposed voluntary wage and price guidelines, inflation kept climbing, hitting 12% by 1980.
Yeah, it just wouldn't go away. And in an effort to combat that high inflation, the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker tightened the money supply dramatically, causing interest rates to skyrocket.
How high did they go?
Reaching as high as 20%.
20%.
Yeah, that had a brutal impact. It severely hurt sales for big-ticket items like cars and houses, and drove unemployment up, reaching 7.5% by 1980. It was a classic recessionary pressure used to break inflation, but painful.
Carter also continued the trend of deregulation that began under Ford. The Air Transportation Deregulation Act of 1978 ended government control over airline fares and routes.
Something the sources point to as highlighting his more conservative democratic leanings. He also reinstated registration for a peacetime draft for 18-year-old males, though no draft was actually held.
In foreign policy, Carter sought a different path, introducing what the sources call humanitarian diplomacy, attempting to base foreign policy more on human rights.
The sources suggest this approach was, well, inconsistent and sometimes clashed with traditional U.S. interests. While he criticized countries like Cuba and Uganda and cut aid to Uruguay, Argentina, and Ethiopia for human rights abuses, he didn't apply the same pressure to strategically important allies like South Korea and the Philippines.
Okay.
He did, however, strongly champion the black majority in South Africa and denounced apartheid. Ultimately, the sources deem this approach ultimately ineffective in fundamentally changing the behavior of other nations.
Despite the inconsistencies, Carter did have significant foreign policy achievements. He successfully negotiated the Panama Canal Treaty, which arranged for the canal's transfer to Panama in 1999 while guaranteeing its neutrality.
That was a big one. And his signature foreign policy success was arguably the Camp David Accords in September 1978.
Camp David, right. Seeing the potential for conflict between Egypt and Israel, Carter brought Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem begin to Camp David for a summit.
After 13 grueling days of negotiations, Carter persuaded them to sign an accord that set the two nations on a path towards peace, a truly groundbreaking moment in the Middle East.
Incredible achievement.
Absolutely. Though the sources note that the PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, continued to oppose Israel through terrorism, and tragically Sadat was later assassinated by Muslim extremists within Egypt.
Carter also completed the process of officially recognizing the People's Republic of China in 1979, ending official U.S. diplomatic relations with Taiwan.
Right. While the UN had made this shift earlier, conservatives in the U.S. were highly critical, calling it a sellout.
On the Cold War front, Carter tried to build on détente, signing the SALT II treaty with the USSR in 1979. However, this treaty was never ratified by the U.S. Senate.
Never ratified. And the event that sealed the failure of SALT II and marked the definitive end of détente was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979.
Afghanistan. That changed everything.
It did. Carter's response was sharp. He announced the Carter Doctrine, stating the U.S. would use force to protect the Persian Gulf region, vital for oil supplies. He stopped grain and technology shipments to the USSR, withdrew SALT II from Senate consideration, and led a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics.
The Olympic boycott.
The Soviets retaliated by boycotting the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. The sources note the Soviet struggle in Afghanistan became their own Russia's Vietnam.
But the most defining foreign policy crisis of Carter's presidency, and a major factor in his 1980 defeat, was the Iran hostage crisis. This stemmed from the Iranian Revolution of 1978, which overthrew the U.S.-backed Shah.
Yeah. The new leader was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a religious figure who established a conservative Islamic state, reversing the Shah's Western-oriented reforms. Revolutionaries deeply resented the U.S., calling it the Great Satan due to its long history of supporting the Shah.
Including that 1953 CIA coup.
Exactly. The 1953 CIA-backed overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh that helped consolidate the Shah's power. That history mattered.
The crisis erupted when Carter allowed the exiled Shah into the U.S. for medical treatment in October 1979.
Right. In response, on November 4th, about 400 Iranian students and revolutionaries stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking the occupants captive.
Hostages, how long were they held?
Their main demands were the return of the Shah for trial and the confiscation of his wealth. Carter responded by freezing Iranian assets in the U.S. and imposing a trade embargo. While some hostages, women and black hostages, were eventually released, 52 others were held for over a year. 444 days.
444 days.
Carter authorized a Marine rescue attempt in April 1980, but it was a disaster, failing after helicopter breakdowns in a crash that killed 8 servicemen.
Oh, terrible.
This failed rescue attempt and the prolonged nature of the crisis, with daily news updates showing the hostages, severely damaged Carter's image. He was increasingly perceived as weak, indecisive, and unable to resolve the situation.
The hostages were finally released. When?
After 444 days following extensive negotiations that included Carter releasing Iranian assets. The sources point out that in a final act of defiance, the hostages were released on January 20 in 1981, minutes after Ronald Reagan had taken his inaugural oath, denying Carter the moment of overseeing their return as president.
Oh, wow, what an insult.
Yeah. These accumulated challenges, economic stagflation, the energy crisis, the perceived ineffectiveness in foreign policy, and the trauma of the Iran hostage crisis set the stage for the election of 1980, which marked the beginning in what became known as the Reagan Revolution.
The Democrats renominated Jimmy Carter, despite a primary challenge from Senator Edward Kennedy, whose candidacy was hampered by the lingering questions around the Chappaquiddick incident years earlier.
The Republicans nominated Ronald Reagan, the former California governor, who had become the prominent spokesman for American conservatism. His background is interesting, a B-movie actor who started as a New Deal Democrat but shifted right.
Right, GE spokesman, Screen Actors Guild president.
Helped purge communists, and then a popular 2-term governor of California from 66 to 74.
There was also a notable third-party candidate, John Anderson, a moderate Republican congressman who ran as an independent.
Reagan's campaign platform was a clear contrast to the previous decade. He called for significant reductions in government spending and taxes, promoting the trickle-down idea that tax cuts would stimulate investment and grow the economy.
He advocated shifting power away from the federal government towards the states and strongly championed traditional American values, family, religion, hard work, and patriotism.
He took a very tough stance on the Soviet Union, vowing to rebuild the U.S. military. He received enthusiastic support from the emerging New Right, including powerful evangelical Christian groups like Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority,
Right.
which advocated for socially conservative positions like banning abortion, denouncing homosexuality, opposing the ERA and affirmative action, and supporting school prayer and harsher criminal penalties.
Reagan explicitly denounced what he called the activist government and the failed social engineering of the 1960s Great Society, promising to get the government off people's backs.
Carter, in contrast, largely defended his record but struggled to inspire voters. He was burdened by the double-digit inflation and the ongoing Iran crisis. He attempted to paint Reagan as a warmonger who might lead the country into nuclear conflict, but it wasn't enough.
The result was a landslide victory for Reagan. He won 489 electoral votes to Carter's 49 and took over 51% of the popular vote, a decisive win.
Huge win. Carter was the first elected president to lose re-election since Herbert Hoover during the Great Depression. The election also saw Republicans gain control of the Senate for the first time in 25 years. It signaled a major shift in the political landscape, truly ushering in the conservative Reagan Revolution.
And the start of Reagan's presidency wasn't without drama. Just over 2 months after taking office in March 1981, he survived an assassination attempt by John Hinckley Jr.
Right, though his press secretary, James Brady, was severely wounded.
Reagan's signature policy was his economic program, often dubbed Reaganomics or supply-side economics. The core theory, based on that trickle-down idea.
Yeah, the idea was that cutting taxes, particularly on the wealthy and businesses, would encourage them to invest rather than consume. This investment would spur production, create jobs, and ultimately lead to widespread prosperity, generating enough economic growth that even with lower tax rates, government revenue would supposedly increase.
The key piece of legislation was the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, which enacted a 25% tax cut phased in over 3 years. Alongside these tax cuts, Reagan pushed for large reductions in domestic programs.
Yeah, cutting budgets for things like education, food stamps, public housing, and the arts, while promising to maintain a safety net only for those he deemed truly needy, such as the disabled.
Simultaneously, the defense budget saw a substantial increase, adding $12 billion in spending aimed at rebuilding the military.
And the combination of significant tax cuts and increased military spending led to a rapid and massive increase in the national debt. The sources note the national debt tripled under Reagan, going from $1 trillion in 1980 to $3 trillion by 1988. Yeah. To try and manage this, taxes actually had to be increased again in 1984, despite the earlier cuts. The U.S. also became a debtor nation again in the mid-1980s for the first time since World War I.
Interesting perspective in the sources, though, suggesting this massive debt was serendipitous for conservatives because it constrained government spending.
Right, limited the growth of social programs simply because there wasn't money available. An interesting take.
The economy did face a recession in late 1981, bottoming out in December 1982. This was partly due to the Federal Reserve's continued tight money policy under Volcker,
which, while effective at bringing down inflation, initially slowed the economy. Unemployment peaked at 10%, and the deficit hit a then-record $159 billion by 1983.
But inflation did come down significantly.
It did, dropping from that 12% in 1979 to around 4% by 1984, helped by decreased demand during the recession and an increase in global oil supply. As the Federal Reserve eased interest rates, coupled with lower inflation and the economic stimulus from the tax cuts, the economy began to recover. Business activity increased, and unemployment fell below 8%.
Deregulation, which had started under Carter, continued under Reagan. Industries like AT&T, airlines, and trucking were significantly deregulated.
Right. The sources note this led to consolidation, with many smaller companies unable to compete and failing. This era also saw the savings and loan crisis and subsequent bailout.
The S&L crisis. How did deregulation play into that?
While many S&Ls were struggling by the early 80s, the sources suggest Reagan's deregulation in the S&L industry contributed to the problem, allowing for riskier loans and, in some cases, outright mismanagement and fraud that bilked institutions out of millions.
Risky lending extended to third-world countries, and the period saw a wave of corporate mergers, acquisitions, and leveraged buyouts, LBOs, that often left companies with massive debt loads.
Yeah, LBOs were huge then. Bankruptcy was sometimes used to shed this debt, offering hefty tax write-offs. The ultimate consequence was a government bailout, costing taxpayers over $500 billion starting in 1989 to cover the failed S&L institutions.
A notable early action demonstrating Reagan's stance on labor unions was his response to the air traffic controllers' strike by the PATO union in August 1981. This was an illegal strike by federal employees.
Reagan's reaction was swift and decisive. He fired over 11,000 striking controllers after they ignored his order to return to work, using replacement workers and military controllers.
Fire them all.
Yep. The sources note this effectively destroyed the PATO union and was seen as a clear signal to other unions about the administration's stance.
On social issues, Reagan made a historic appointment to the Supreme Court, naming Sandra Day O'Connor as the first female Associate Justice.
A big moment. However, the sources also point out that his administration appointed fewer women and minorities overall compared to Carter's. Reagan opposed concepts like equal pay for equal work and the renewal of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
And Supreme Court decisions during this period were seen by some critics as rolling back civil rights gains.
That's the criticism mentioned, yeah. For example, ending affirmative action in government hiring, overturning some desegregation orders, and challenging racial voting districts in cases like the North Carolina gerrymandering decision.
The election of 1984 saw the Democrats nominate Walter Mondale, Carter's former VP, who made history by selecting Geraldine Ferraro as his running mate.
The first female vice presidential nominee from a major party. Historic.
Mondale criticized Reagan primarily on the huge budget deficits, the high unemployment and interest rates from the recession, and the cuts to social services. But Reagan and George Bush were easily renominated by the Republicans.
And the result was another massive landslide victory for Reagan. 525 electoral votes to Mondale's 13, 60% of the popular vote.
Yeah.
The sources note this election signaled a significant breakdown of the traditional Democratic coalition that had held since FDR, losing support among industrial workers, farmers, and the poor, with only black voters remaining a solidly Democratic bloc.
Key domestic policy continued in his second term. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 was a major overhaul.
Right, lowering the top personal income tax rate significantly, from 50% down to 28%, and also cutting corporate taxes, while closing many tax shelters and credits. A really big change to the tax code.
The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 attempted to address illegal immigration through a mix of measures.
Penalizing employers who hired undocumented workers, increasing resources for the INS, and offering resident status to those who could prove continuous residence since 1982. The sources suggest it initially reduced the flow but saw increases again later. Kind of a mixed result.
And the Iran-Contra scandal occurred during this term, raising questions about presidential authority and, to some, echoing concerns about the imperial presidency.
Yeah, by secretly circumventing congressional authority, that definitely brought back those concerns for some.
Mergers and acquisitions continued at a rapid pace, encouraged by deregulation, the growing global economy, and tax breaks. This contributed to the rise of large multinational corporations.
Then came Black Monday on October 19th, 1987. A sharp stock market drop. Stock prices had soared earlier in the decade, partly due to eased financial regulations. On that single day, the Dow Jones average fell over 500 points.
Black Monday. Big shock.
Huge. Congress responded quickly, reducing 1988 taxes by $30 billion, fearing a recession. The market did recover, with indexes doubling by the mid-1990s, but it was a scary moment.
Another tragic event in the second term was the Challenger space shuttle explosion in February 1986, killing all 7 astronauts, including the first teacher in space.
Just heartbreaking. The sources note this damaged NASA's credibility and raised doubts about the complexity and reliability of technology needed for ambitious projects like the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI.
SDI, Star Wars.
Right. And the Supreme Court and the culture war issues continued to be a significant theme, with court decisions seen by some as impacting gains in areas like civil rights and affirmative action.
Looking back at Reagan's economic legacy through the sources, the combination of tax cuts and increased military spending led to about $200 billion in lost annual revenue. The national debt tripled.
Tripled again. And the sources emphasize that these deficits didn't begin to shrink until Bill Clinton's presidency in the mid-1990s. Again, the idea presented is that this debt, while perhaps not intended, was beneficial for conservatives by effectively limiting the growth of government spending going forward.
And finally, our deep dive takes us to a pivotal period in global history that began towards the end of Reagan's presidency, the beginning of the end of the Cold War.
A central figure in this shift was Mikhail Gorbachev, who became the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. He began implementing significant reforms, glasnost, perestroika.
Allowing more free speech, introducing some capitalist economic ideas, even limited democracy.
Right. He also signaled a willingness to engage with the West in new ways, notably offering to stop deploying intermediate-range nuclear forces, or INF, if the U.S. eliminated theirs.
This led to a historic agreement, the INF Treaty, signed in Washington, D.C. in December 1987 after 2 years of negotiation.
This treaty banned all ground-launched intermediate-range nuclear missiles from Europe, a truly significant breakthrough in the Cold War arms race.
Reagan and Gorbachev issued a joint statement that was unthinkable just years earlier, declaring that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought.
Amazing statement. The sources revisit the strategic thinking here, contrasting the long-standing concept of mutual assured destruction, MAD, which created a balance of terror, with the idea of nuclear utilization theory, NUTS.
Nuts.
Yeah, which some within the Reagan administration reportedly explored, contemplating the possibility of winning a nuclear war with reasonable losses. A chilling concept.
Reagan's dramatic increase in defense spending is also cited by the sources as placing enormous economic pressure on the Soviet system.
Right. When Gorbachev came to power, he recognized the Soviet economy couldn't compete and needed fundamental reform, pushing him towards the changes he implemented rather than simply trying to match the U.S. buildup. Some historians, according to the sources, credit Reagan's policies with contributing significantly to the Soviet Union's eventual collapse.
The physical symbol of the Cold War, the Iron Curtain, began to fall dramatically in 1989.
Yeah, the sources suggest the cost of maintaining control over satellite states, both politically and economically, had become unsustainable for the Soviets. And Gorbachev's reforms, particularly allowing more openness, unleashed forces for change in Eastern Europe that couldn't be contained.
A wave of independence swept the region. Poland saw the rise of the Solidarity movement. Hungary opened its borders.
The Berlin Wall was torn down in November 1989, leading to the reunification of Germany the following year. Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia with the Velvet Revolution, and Romania also saw rapid changes, sometimes violent in Romania's case.
Incredible pace of change.
Astonishing. This period also saw significant nuclear weapons reductions under President George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev, with dramatic cutbacks in intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, through treaties like START, aiming for significant overall reductions in nuclear arsenals.
This led to discussions about a potential peace dividend.
Right, the idea that freed-up defense spending could be redirected to domestic needs like social programs, infrastructure, or reducing the national debt.
And the process culminated on December 25, 1991, with the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union itself, marking the official end of the Cold War.
The end of an era.
Wow, wow. That was truly a deep dive into a period packed with tectonic shifts, from those dramatic foreign policy pivots and the bewildering economic turbulence of stagflation to the searing domestic crisis of Watergate and the unraveling of the Cold War itself.
We really saw how concepts like détente and realpolitik were put to the test on the global stage, how the energy crisis brought international instability right into American homes and businesses, and how the economy struggled with problems that policymakers hadn't effectively faced before.
And we navigated the fallout from Watergate, seeing not just the scandal, but how Congress attempted to rein in what was perceived as an imperial presidency. We also touched on the impact of Supreme Court decisions and the growing environmental movement.
And finally, we traced the roots of the conservative shift with Reagan's rise and witnessed the dramatic final act of the Cold War. It really highlights how interconnected seemingly disparate events can be across foreign policy, the economy, and domestic politics.
Thinking about all these profound changes that reshaped America and the world.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, here's something to consider for yourself. How do the economic challenges and the policy responses of the 1970s and 80s, particularly the struggles with inflation and unemployment and the debates over government spending and taxation, how do those compare to the economic debates we are having today?
And this raises another important question. What might that historical push and pull between the imperial presidency and Congress in the wake of Vietnam and Watergate tell us about the ongoing dynamics and balance of power within the U.S. government right now? Something to think about.